I'm going to do something a little different in this video. My wife and I bought a travel trailer last year. And if you own a trailer or maybe own a boat, you know there's always something to work on, something to fix, something to upgrade. In this case, it's an upgrade. So at the corner of our counter, which is relatively small, it's a 19-foot trailer, the countertop ends near the sink, and when we're doing dishes, it'd be nice to have a little extra room to one side of the sink. So my wife has asked me to build a tilt-up shelf that will be able to hold, dishes and things while we're washing. So I'm going to walk through the process of how I come up with a design, and I'll go through some of the steps, which typically involves, drawing pencil and paper, and then I'll switch to Sketchup to work out the details, get things to scale. So I'll jump onto Sketchup in a little bit. My training, and for the first 13 years of my work career, I worked as a mechanical engineer at Hughes Aircraft. And I was, at that time, designing and helping build mechanisms for spacecraft that would deploy antennas, things like that. So, in that situation, everything's got to be really excellent. It has to work. You only get one chance, that kind of stuff. So I think because of that and just my engineer brain, I tend to overdo things a little bit, so I'll just admit that right up front. The design is, it's just a piece of Baltic birch, about 14 by 18. It's going to flip up. And I initially started looking for hardware that I could purchase to make the flip up mechanism. And there's a lot of things out there that are made, just for that purpose. But, looking at reviews and looking at the mechanisms and stuff, the stuff was either, pretty cheaply built and, you had to fuss with it to get it to fold, or it was well built, but then way overkill for what we needed. So I switched gears. Instead of coming or trying to find some hardware I could use, I thought I'm just going to make something that, once it's up, there's another piece that flips out. Now it's all wood. I'm just using basic hinges, and that simplified things. I can pretty much make the whole thing myself once I figure out the hinge situation. I'm going to switch now to SketchUp and kind of walk through my thought process and how I came up with the design that I'm going to be building. We're in SketchUp here, and this is my original design. I've got the cabinet modeled here just very simply. The sink is actually sitting up in here. It's the countertop. It's got a little bit of a curve to it. So the size of the cabinet is roughly correct at the end, and this is the size of the shelf that we wanted. Now you can see here I have chosen some hinges. So this hinge is a narrow butt hinge. It was a little hard to find something that narrow that was of decent quality. So I did find something on the Lee Valley website. This is it here, extra narrow butt hinges. They had a couple different options, but this size, which I believe is the 2 by 7/8, that fit well within the constraints that I had. And then for the other hinges, I had initially thought I could use butt hinges here, but it was going to be difficult to squeeze them in there. And if I did squeeze them in, there would be a mortise on the back side here, and then that didn't leave me much room for screws. So I was going to go with these pivot hinges. Here they are, once again, Lee Valley. I just stumbled across these, and they looked like they were going to work well. They had a couple of different configurations. They called that a pivot and a rear pivot. So this looked like it might work well. So I guessed at the sizes of the parts and came up with this design. You can see I'm just noticing there I've got the hole kind of in the wrong spot, but you get the idea. So that was going to work. So I ordered the hinges. Now you always want to make sure you have hardware in hand before you start building something. And what I found was the butt hinges were as expected, but these pivot hinges were a little bigger. This is the actual size. When I had originally modeled them, they're a little bit smaller. And it looked like it was going to be a bit of a stretch to squeeze them in there. It wasn't really very clean. And as I was modeling this, it occurred to me, I don't need to buy a hinge. I can just, put a pin at the top of this and essentially make my own pivot. I won't even call it a hinge. So that's what I did. So here is the current version. So that's in the down position. I've got a couple of scenes here. There it is up, and the same butt hinge. And you can see now, there's no hinge showing. If I go to the X-ray mode, you can see I've got the pivot pin and the socket there at both ends. And that really simplified things, made it a little bit cleaner. So I finished my model, came up with the drawings of the parts. So I've got the drawing of the shelf and the affixed part of the shelf and the support here. So now I'm ready to go out into the shop. I also created a cut list, not that big a deal. It's only 4 parts. So I was ready to start making some sawdust. Okay, back out in the shop. I've got my cut list, got my 2 drawings, to cover the parts on them. I've got some material here, so I dug through my stash of stuff. I've got one piece that will work for the support, and then I'll cut the shelf out of that piece. So let's start cutting up the parts. Okay, I've got the basic parts cut out. I've got the shelf, the support that's going to be attached to the cabinet side. Now I realize now that I'm looking at this, I should have left this bigger because I'm going to have to route some hinge mortises in here, but I think I'll be okay with that. So that's pretty much ready. The support that is going to hold the pin that this is going to pivot on, this is only a short piece, but I left it long so I had something to hang on to when I'm drilling holes in it. And that was just a piece of scrap I had laying around. So next up is the support. Now remember, this has this cutout and it's hollowed out on the inside, so just to keep the weight down. So I'll walk through how I do that. The first thing I'm going to do is lay out my cuts. Okay, I've got my pattern laid out here. I'm going to start by making this cut, and then of course the tricky thing is going to be cutting this out, so we'll get to that in a sec. I'm going to cut this on my sled. I've got the line on which I want to cut lined up with the kerf. I'm just doing that by eye. Now if I was teaching, I wouldn't let one of my students do this, but I'm not teaching now, and this is how I'm going to do it, so that's what I'm going to show you. So I could just hold this. I could, put some screws in here and clamp this down. I'm just going to hold it, but I don't really trust myself just to hold it by itself. I'm pivoting off of just a single point here. So I'm going to put this stop up against here to give me something a little more stable. And I'm going to clamp this in place here. No, that doesn't go quite deep enough. I need a bigger clamp. Okay, and that's pretty stable now, so I'm comfortable with that. Okay, that felt real stable. That wasn't didn't want to move around or anything. So that, in fact, that's a little stuck there. There we go. Okay, next up, I need to make that cutout. Now that's going to be a little trickier. I think I'm going to use my router table for that. I need to give it a little thought first. Okay, so I've thought about this a little bit, and of course I thought about this before I started cutting the material, but sometimes until you actually have the part in your hand, it can be a little challenging to figure out what you're going to do. So I'm going to rough cut it out with a jigsaw. And then I'm going to pin nail some pieces on here, that align with those lines. And I'm going to set this on my router table and use a flush trim bit just to trim up to those pieces, right? The bearing will ride on those pieces, and that should work out great. I'll be left with some, little holes from the pin nailer, but those are 23 gauge pins, and those holes are so small, I'm not going to worry about it. I could use double stick tape. I try not to use that just because it's not always as positive as the pin nailer. Sometimes it's on there so good it's hard to get the tape back or get the parts back off. So I think in this case, because there's not a lot of forces involved, I'm just going to use my pin nailer, and that should work out just fine. I cut some 1-inch strips of MDF on the table saw. I like to use a 1/4 inch for pattern routing and things like this because there's just enough room for the bearing to ride on there, but still, reach the part I want to cut. These are 1 inch, which is this distance, so I can just align these with the edge of my part there. And these are 1/2 inch pins, so they're only going into the plywood about 1/4 inch, which should make it relatively easy to get them out. Now this last piece, I'll have to cut to length to fit in there, and then I'll go ahead and pin that in place too. Next, I need to cut out the hole. I probably should have done that before I put these on, but I've drilled holes in here about 1/8 inch away, connected the dots on the back side, and I'll go ahead and cut this out. All right, that worked well. I was careful in the corners because I'm routing into a fairly sharp corner. I don't want to kind of get trapped in the corner, so I just nibbled away a little bit at a time. So I should be able to now, with this relatively dull chisel, just to pry these off. Now, since the plywood is denser than the MDF, the nails are going to stick in the plywood, but I should still be able to get them out without too much trouble. Now, to get the nails out, if you just grab them and try and pull them, it typically doesn't work. It's easy to break them off. So what I like to do is take just some regular pliers, grab on the edge of the pliers, right at one edge, and then if you just rotate that a little bit, you're kind of levering it out, and once it breaks free, then they're fairly easy to get out. Now, before I leave the router table, I want to make sure I route a radius on here. So that's going to pivot like that. So the radius needs to be here. I've got a 1/4 inch round over bit in there, and we'll go ahead and clean that up. I'm going to round over these edges a little bit, but before I do that, I want to round the outer corners of the flip-up shelf. So I have a jig. I've got a bunch, I don't know, half a dozen of these that have different radii on them. And then just a couple of pieces of material here to align that. So if I just line that up like that with both edges here, now I've got this radius I can use a pattern bit on and just route that corner on there. So you can almost do that without even looking at it to align it. So I'll clamp that in place and we'll route that. I'm going to round over the edge of this now. I've got a 3/32 round over bit in here. I kind of think of that as the Goldilocks round over bit. A 1/16 is too small, an 1/8 is too big, so this is right in between. It's kind of a sweet spot for the way I like to do things, so I'm going to go ahead and round over the corners of all these parts here.